UFC 299 was such a great night of fights, and it left us with a lot to talk about, and that's exactly what I'm going to do in this follow-up video. I am going to give you my observations from the fights and tie in a lot of the things that I was saying in the lead up to this card. Along with that, I'm going to give you what I think are the good points and the bad points for each of the matches that happened on the main card. And I'm also going to tell you where I think each fighter goes from here and what are the best matches to make after this. As always, everything is timestamped down in the progress bar. If you want to jump around or go to a specific point, you can certainly do that. And of course, if you appreciate the content and the effort, please go ahead and give the video a like, subscribe to the channel. And with that, let's jump into my honorable mention, which is the fight between Blaydes and Jailton Almeida. I only did the main card in my last video, so I did not cover any of the prelim fights, and I have not yet said anything on this particular match, but I definitely would not have predicted what happened in this fight. Kudos to Blaydes for hanging tough through the first round where he was really getting dominated in the grappling, which is his area of strength, and coming back in the second round for a finish win. It was really impressive, but it was also really strange because I couldn't quite tell if something happened to Jailton Almeida on his dive in for the leg. After I watched it several times, it looked like maybe something clipped him on the way in and hurt him a little bit. But regardless of that, I don't think I've ever seen a fight where hammer fists from short range in that type of position have ever finished a fight. But Blaydes was just raining down as hard as he could from that position, and he just crumbled Almeida. I think pretty much everybody was shocked by that outcome, and it definitely changes the trajectory of both of these guys, because I think Jailton was considered to be probably pretty close to a title shot, and now with this loss, obviously he's going to fall back a bit, but at the same time, this now elevates Blaydes, and I think the real best next thing for him is going to be a match against Tom Aspinall. First of all, they've needed to run that back ever since it happened when Tom injured his leg. Second of all, there's just a logjam going on right now because of the John Jones and Stipe situation. Tom really needs someone to fight, and I think now Blaydes is a great answer for that. So again, shocker outcome, kudos to Blaydes. I'll look forward to seeing what happens with him next. All right, now we move on to the main card. And if you didn't see my last video on this card or the one on Sean O'Malley versus Chito Vera, so many of the things that happened on this card are the things that I laid out in those videos. Starting out with Petr Yan versus Song Yadong. This fight went almost exactly as I expected it to, and Yan came away with the decision win, but I will say that he definitely got there a little differently than I expected. I was pretty surprised to see him biting on feints as much as he did and also seeming very timid on the feet, like he didn't really want to get hit. I really believe that these two guys were almost clones of each other, but that Yan was just a little bit better, and that's pretty much what proved out to be the case. So in typical Yan fashion, he loses the first round, sort of gets his bearings, and comes back and wins the second and the third with a combination of both striking but a lot of grappling that it took to win the fight. I did expect him to get a little bit more advantage on the feet than he did, but he got enough of what he needed there and was able to just secure the rest of the fight on the ground. So it definitely wasn't the most entertaining fight on the card, but it was still a good one nonetheless. So now that Yan is back in the win column and we look forward to what might be next for him, it's actually a little bit difficult to say because of some of the things that are going on in the bantamweight division. I think the absolute best matchup for him would be Henry Cejudo now that he's decided not to retire. But the way Henry's been talking, I'm not sure if he's planning on going down to flyweight or not. But if he doesn't go down, I think Yan would be a great test for him and also reveal whether Henry still has what it takes to get back to the top. I think Yan would be a great win if he was able to get it, and it would show he's still elite in the division. Not to mention, both of them are coming off of losses to Merab, so it makes even more sense that they fight each other now. Hopefully, after finally getting a win here, Yan will be able to get back to his old form where he's less defensive and less timid in the way that he fights. And like I said, Henry is the most exciting matchup for him. I think that's the one to make. And if we look at Song Yadong, I think the next logical step for him would either be to take on somebody higher in the rankings like Umar Nurmagomedov, and let's see if he has what it takes to move on up, or a rematch now with Chito Vera, since there was some debate about who really won the first fight, and now they're both coming off of losses. Next, we move on to Gilbert Burns versus Jack Della Maddalena. This was the biggest disappointment for me on the entire card because you have a guy in Gilbert Burns who just never lives up to the big moments. This fight came so close to the exact outcome that I predicted, which was a Gilbert Burns decision, and with about a minute left, he completely fumbles the bag and makes an amateur grappling move. Now, this is a guy who is a world champion grappler. He makes an amateur move, gives Jack Della Maddalena the advantage and the ability to roll out of the position because he had Jack fully secured under the weight of his whole body. You could tell on Jack's face that he was struggling and unable to move. and out of nowhere, Gilbert himself pushes forward off of the cage and gives momentum to Jack so that he can roll himself out of the position and get back to his feet with such little time left. And then rather than being defensive and knowing he had the fight wrapped up and just sort of playing it safe until the end, he goes in for another takedown, catches a hard knee, and Jack finishes him thereafter. It was a really embarrassing moment for Gilbert Burns, and at this point, I am just convinced he is never going to be the guy who can ever rise to the occasion when it matters. He's had 4 pinnacle moments in his career over the last 4 years, and he's come up short in every single one of them. So unfortunately, I think the only future left for Gilbert Burns at this point is to just be a tough matchup for new up-and-comers, and that's it. It's really sad to say, but he will just never be championship level, and Gilbert will never have another championship fight again in his career, most likely. But as hard as I'm going on Gilbert, I'm not going to let Jack off the hook. His stand-up looked decent against Gilbert, but Gilbert doesn't really have great stand-up. He has hard punches, hard shots, that's about it. So Jack was getting the better of the stand-up exchanges, but it wasn't anything really impressive, and it certainly wasn't anything that looked championship caliber to me. So I feel like he definitely needs several more matches before we start talking any sort of title contention for him. Not to mention, it's pretty clear that he can be dominated by the elite wrestlers in the division. So if he wants to continue to climb the ranks, he's definitely going to have to continue to improve in that area. So with all that said, let's talk about the best matchups to make for each of these guys going forward. Starting with Gilbert Burns, like I said, I think it's time for him to start being a stepping stone for the guys who are ranked below him. And I think there's 3 interesting matches that could be made for him next. One of them is Ian Garry if you wanted to give Garry a chance to get a win over a bigger name. But there's a lot of other fights that I think are more interesting for Ian Garry, so this would be low on my list. I think Sean Brady could also make a lot of sense for Gilbert, although again, that's not my top pick because I have a higher preference for Brady. So I think the absolute best fight next for Gilbert Burns is going to be Jeff Neal. They're both coming off of losses. They're both guys who never seem to live up to the moment when it matters. Their styles could make for a pretty interesting fight. And I think it could be given a lot of significance by basically being positioned as a career ender for the loser of that fight. Because if you think about it, the loser of that particular fight would basically become irrelevant in the division. And it really wouldn't matter if they got cut or just retired altogether. If we turn our attention to Jack, I know that he called out Shavkat, but after that performance, he definitely does not deserve him yet. Also, I think Shavkat would be a much bigger threat to him on the ground than Gilbert was, and I'm just not sure that's something he should want to take on just yet. Again, I think there's a few possible matchups for Jack that would both make sense and be interesting. Although again, this is not my top pick, I think Ian Garry and Jack could make a good matchup and serve as sort of a rising star eliminator. We'd pretty much be guaranteed that that would be a stand-up battle, and it would be interesting to see how Jack's stand-up would match up against Garry's. But like I said, that's not my top pick because there are matches I like more for Garry. So I would say next on the list would be Colby Covington. I know Ian Garry has talked a lot about fighting Colby Covington, but Colby is very protective of his image and his career, and I just don't think he's going to try to give somebody like Ian Garry the opportunity to get a win over him or to embarrass him. So I would ultimately be surprised if Covington accepted a fight with Garry. And at the same time, I would think Colby would probably view Jack as a relatively low threat compared to some of the other potential matchups in the division. So I think that matchup makes a lot of sense for both guys. And I think if Jack wants to get the biggest bump in his name ID, that's the best match. But I also think a great next match for Jack would be Sean Brady. Both of these guys have stellar win records. The style differences would make for an interesting match, and I think it would help propel one of them into the upper echelon of the division. Both of those guys are in a similar enough spot now where one of them needs to prove who's going to be able to move up and be a contender in the division and who's going to fall back down the mountain a little bit. All right, now we move on to Kevin Holland versus Michael Venom Page. I think the first thing that we can all agree on with this fight is that adding Michael Venom Page to the UFC was an incredible addition. First of all, he seemed right at home with the big stage. He didn't let that get to him at all. His showmanship and entertainment level is about as high as it gets, and he could potentially have a very exciting future in the UFC. Regarding the fight itself, it went pretty much exactly like I predicted. I chose Michael Venom Page by decision. I figured that Kevin Holland was going to be just too difficult to put away, and he was. We definitely had a competition for the best chin in the UFC between Kevin Holland and Chito Vera on this card, and I knew that he was going to be very difficult to finish. But like I said in my last video, Kevin Holland is not in a place where he has to care about winning or losing. That really doesn't matter for him. His career in the UFC is just as safe whether he loses or if he wins. because he's an exciting sort of a guy and he serves as a really good gatekeeper. And even though these guys are so similar in a lot of ways, especially with their build, MVP is just the better of the two. And for the most part, he made Holland look silly and like a punching bag. You could tell that he wasn't afraid of anything from Kevin Holland, and so he threw a bunch of the flashy type of stuff that's very high risk if you miss, and he just didn't care. And even though MVP did have a lot of misses and incidents where he would fall down after trying to throw a flashy kick, Kevin Holland wasn't able to do anything about it. So when it comes to what's next for these guys, I think the picture is very unclear for Kevin Holland, and I think there is one match to make for MVP. Kevin Holland has enough losses at this point that it's really hard to imagine anybody in the top 10 wanting to take a risk and give him a shot. So I don't know who is going to be the best next match for him, but you could put him with somebody like Vicente Luque or even Neil Magny, or what probably makes the most sense is to find a good prospect in the top 20 sort of a space, somebody who's currently ranked below Kevin Holland, and give them an opportunity to shine by fighting him. But when we look at the picture for MVP, it's a lot more clear, and I think there's absolutely one best pick for him to fight next, and that is Ian Garry. Now, I know that a lot of people have been hanging on the idea of Ian Garry fighting Colby Covington, but like I said earlier, I think the chances of that are very low unless Colby is absolutely forced to accept that fight. I really don't think there's any way that Colby on his own accepts that fight or wants that fight, because he doesn't want to give somebody like Ian Garry the chance to possibly get a win over him and to embarrass him. And I'm not saying that would or wouldn't happen. I'm just saying that's the risk that I don't think Colby would want to take, and that's why we haven't heard him chirping about Ian Garry, even though Ian Garry's been out there talking a lot of crap about him. So I think after what happened last night, everybody should forget about Ian versus Colby and focus on MVP versus Ian Garry. I think that's absolutely one of the best welterweight matchups you can make at this point. First of all, Ian Garry called out Stephen Thompson, and MVP is a taller and potentially better version of Stephen Thompson with a very similar style. And I know that some people were talking about Stephen Thompson versus MVP after this, but keep in mind, Stephen Thompson has made it clear he wants nothing to do with MVP in a fight. He has already said it on many occasions, and it's probably because he knows the style is very similar and it's a really bad matchup for him. I have been a fair but significant critic of Ian Garry and his future in the division, but if he fought somebody like MVP and was able to win that fight, I would be happy to admit I was wrong about him. As far as the division goes, this fight makes a lot of sense. If Ian Garry wins, it would clearly establish him as one of the most elite strikers in the welterweight division for sure, and it would be very easy at that point to argue he is ready for a title shot. On the other hand, if MVP wins, it would show that he can take out one of the hottest prospects in the division. I believe it would establish him for sure as the best striker at welterweight, and it would probably put him in the position to either fight for a title after that or with only one more good win. So as far as I'm concerned, Ian Garry versus MVP is the only fight to make for those two, and I hope the UFC does it. All right, moving on here to Dustin Poirier versus Benoit Saint Denis. If you did see my last video on this fight card, I was very timid in any sort of prediction when it came to this fight because I was conflicted by a lot of different things, and I learned a lot in that process. When I had considered everything that Dustin Poirier had done in the past and how tough he is, and then I also looked at Benoit Saint Denis and I realized how green he was and all the mistakes that he made, my head was telling me that Dustin Poirier was the pick in the fight, but I let myself get influenced by the buzz around Benoit Saint Denis, by other commentators in the community, and also with what just happened to Volkanovski when he got knocked out by Topuria, and it was a similar sort of a feel, and so I just didn't know what direction I wanted to go with that fight. I also let myself get influenced by Benoit himself because after one of his last wins, he got on the microphone and he thanked the US and the US military for essentially saving France back in World War II, and it really made me like the guy, so I didn't want to criticize him much or I didn't want to go hard on him. So next time out, I will do my best to not fall into those sort of traps. But I did at least share the things that I noticed about Benoit Saint Denis, which is that basically he is a sloppy fighter who leaves a lot of openings that somebody of Dustin Poirier's skill can take advantage of, and sure enough, that's exactly what happened. I pointed out that when Benoit Saint Denis fought Gabriel Miranda rocked him on the feet to the point where he was on the edge of being in trouble, and unfortunately for Miranda, he just wasn't able to do anything with it. But Dustin Poirier is a different kind of a fighter. So when Benoit Saint Denis was sloppy with his stand-up, leaving his guard wide open, it's no surprise at all that Dustin Poirier cracked him and knocked him out. And do not buy into the stuff that people like Lucas Tracy are saying, where they think maybe it was the antibiotics that were causing him to be fatigued and to fatigue early and all the rest. That is not the case. If you go back and watch Benoit St. Denis' old fights, you'll see that he has the same sort of fatigue level after a period of heavy exchanges in those fights as well. The bottom line is he has sloppy defense in his stand-up, he doesn't have the best chin, and he got caught by a better fighter in this case. But at the end of the day, I'm really happy that Dustin was able to win. He's a good guy, and I'd like to see him get one more run at the title before he's done. And Benoit St. Denis is young enough that he'll be able to improve and come back from this. And it is possible that it will be a blessing in disguise for him, because now he knows he's going to have to greatly improve his stand-up defense. And now he knows he can't just rely on his chin to save him, because the sad reality is the chin ain't there for him. If he's getting knocked out like that at age 27, it's only going to get worse from here. So where do these guys go now? If we start with Benoit St. Denis, he's currently ranked number 12. And because he's coming off fighting the guy who's number 3 in the division, I think it's fair for him to look at anybody from number 3 all the way up to where he is at number 12. And there are a lot of great options for him in that range, from Gamrot to Beneil Dariush, Rafael Fiziev, Jailton Turner. Any one of those would be a great next matchup for Benoit St. Denis. Now, when it comes to Dustin Poirier, I think it's fair to be a little more picky with what his options are and with what he should have to do next. I don't feel like it would be fair for Dustin to have to once again extend the olive branch down the chain and fight another up-and-comer. I'm pretty sure he wanted to get that behind him, and now all he wants to focus on is moving forward and getting back to the belt if possible. So here's what I hope to see play out next for Dustin Poirier. I am pretty high in my conviction that Justin Gaethje will beat Max Holloway at UFC 300. And if he does, I think he's absolutely next in line to fight Islam Makhachev, or at least he should be. So what I think makes the most sense for Dustin Poirier is to fight the winner between Charles Oliveira and Arman Tsarukyan. Then whoever wins that match will be next in line to fight for the title, whoever has it. Now, I know some people will criticize that pick because they'll say that Charles Oliveira beat Dustin Poirier so easily the last time that he doesn't deserve another shot at him. But I think that's ridiculous, because basically Islam Makhachev beat Charles Oliveira very easily as well, and yet we're all ready to give him another shot. In addition to that, I do think Chael Sonnen is on to something when he says that for whatever reason, Charles Oliveira does not want to fight Islam Makhachev. So it's very possible that if he beats Arman, that he will be perfectly happy to fight Dustin Poirier again. All right, so now let's get on to the main event. Sean O'Malley showed that he has not only leveled up his game tremendously over time, but also that he's just levels above Chito at everything Chito does. Sean put on one of the most impressive striking displays that I can remember. And on top of that, he showed that his cardio can hold up for 5 rounds. And in the dedicated video that I did about Sean O'Malley versus Chito Vera, I explained the one path that I thought Chito did have to victory, but unfortunately for him, he didn't implement that at all throughout the night, even though there were times he had good opportunities to do so. I essentially said that his best path to victory was to chop the legs of Sean O'Malley, because Sean O'Malley has fragile legs, and that was his biggest weakness. But even though Sean O'Malley did give him a lot of opportunities to take advantage of that, and he didn't, there were also other times where Sean made it pretty difficult for Chito to even kick his legs if he had wanted to. Now, even though Sean is one of the best finishers in the UFC, it was pretty clear from watching Chito over the years that he's just too tough to be finished. He's never even been close to being finished before, so I didn't think Sean was going to get that done. I thought that a decision was going to be the way it went, so you really can't take anything away from Sean for not getting the finish. And perhaps in some ways, the fact that it went all 25 minutes and he was so dominant the whole time was probably actually better for his legacy and people's opinions about whether the first fight was a fluke or not. So if we think about what's next for each of these guys, I think for Sean O'Malley, the direction is pretty clear. Even though he called out Ilya after the fight, I don't think Ilya is going to take that, and has even said as much after the fact by encouraging Sean to go ahead and finish the Merab situation. So I don't think there's any question that Merab is the next fight for Sean. And we've all seen Merab get in situations where he gets hit and it looks like he's possibly in trouble. So if there's one guy in the division that can take him out, it's going to be Sean O'Malley. With regard to Chito, it'll be interesting to see what kind of injuries he comes out of this fight with. It looks like possibly maybe his orbital bone was broken from that knee. And if something like that is the case, he's going to need a long road to recovery before he gets back in there. And I think there's really 3 fights that would make sense for him after this. The first is Petr Yan coming off of his win earlier in the night. I think Yan would be a great test for Vera at this point to see where he remains in the division. Another great option for Vera would be Henry Cejudo if he decides to stay at bantamweight. And like I said earlier in this video, I think a rematch with Song Yadong, because that was a controversial fight and outcome, I think that would make potentially a lot of sense as well. So any of those three options would be good for Vera going forward. All right, folks, that's going to be it for this video. We've definitely covered a lot here, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give the video a like, subscribe to the channel for more in the future. I definitely appreciate when you do that. And as always, let me know down in the comments, what do you think about these fights? What do you think about my opinions on them? And what would you like to see going forward for each person? Thank you as always for being here. I hope you have a great start to your week. Take care.